ones, Lisa here. Thanks for joining me. Thank you for all my new subscribers. It really is helping me grow my channel, so thank you so much for subscribing and following my content. I hope that it helps you and that it makes you feel less stressed when you're painting. That's my aim. Today I'm going to talk to you about white in paintings. So I'll take you through what I recommend and do a little study that you can follow along. Thank you. Have a lovely week. Bye. Leaving paper white instead of using a pen can be difficult and sometimes overwhelming unless you have a lot of experience, and therefore you can be much calmer about it and you have a lot more control over your subject. So this is why today I want to talk to you about little things that can help you with having white highlights or sections of white in your artwork. So even if you have a palette which has a white in it, it is typically not as covering as white gouache will be. So white gouache is like the less transparent cousin of watercolor. And it has the same binding agent. A lot of the times it has the same pigment source. But what you'll find in gouache is it's more like a poster paint. It's meant to be used with the ability to have coverage and not be so transparent. White gouache is much better at adding over your watercolors for highlights than the whites that typically you'll get in your palettes. I'm going to begin by painting some glass marbles. So if I'm making a circle, I hover over the paper, creating a circle in the air, and then I slow it down a little bit. Usually my pinky knuckle is touching the paper then, and I simply let the brush or let the pencil go down onto the paper. And I'm using my whole arm. I'm not down here scribing an arc and then turning my hand. So that repetition to begin with helps me get the physical movement. Might do another one here. Okay, that'll do. I don't know if you can even see that actually. So what I'll do now is I'm just going to wet the paper, and I am purposely going to colour in all of this one, even though I don't want it all painted. I'm just going to use my phthalo green, a little marble. So even though I'm doing wet on wet, I'm still guiding the paint by where I'm putting my brush, because I do have areas where I want it darker specifically and lighter. Now this one over here is a little yellowy one. I'm not going to wet the paper first, just going to show you the difference. I'm going to very wet brush though. And the one back here, I'll leave that until these are dry. So these are going to be two marbles with some colours inside them. And what I want to do is make sure that I'm not leaving any space of white for highlights, because this is about adding highlights. Still too wet. Have patience, Luke. Okay, so these are dried now. I'm just going to use a watercolor pencil to draw in some shapes here. These can be sharper. These are the little veins of different coloured glass inside the marble. And then that's wet on dry, obviously, and then in between that I'm going to lay down a few little areas of darker marble glass colour. And I'm going to leave a little area there because that's where one of my white areas is going to be. And here is where another one of them is going to be. I'm just going to soften those edges off a little. Wet on dry once more. And I'm just going to fade that off with some reduced colour and water on my brush. I'm just going to make this one a green, and again wet on dry. This one I'm going to make a little bit flatter, so I'm not really concerned with grading the colours too much, but just more or less showing that pattern on the inside of the marble. There's something inside there. Okay, and as this one dries, I'm going to add a heavier coat, perhaps even with a touch of just the dark green and a touch of ultramarine in there. And this is again wet on dry, but my brush actually isn't very wet at all. Oopsie, didn't want to do that thick. That's okay. I'm just going to leave them at that. They're quite simple and basic, but the whole point of this exercise is the power of a highlight. So with these two now, I'm going to take you through some ways to add highlights. First of all, if you have white in your palette, I'm just dipping the very tip of my brush in and I'm really agitating the white. And as always, I would have a sample piece of paper already coloured with a colour and testing that. Now, I don't even know if you can see that, but I doubt I will even try that because it's only gone the pastiest colour. I'm out for that one. Now, you know I'm a fan of the Derwent, this particular palette, which is very heavily pigmented. This is a much softer paint, I can tell, so the quality is there. I'm very heavily rubbing, and I'm going to test this one out. That's a lot better, if you can see there. So I'm quite happy with that. It's a lot whiter, but it's still not giving me really great coverage. However, with our marbles, we have a variety of highlights. Some highlights are sharp and some are really subtle. So I've got one here of the window to my right, and I think that degree of brightness might be good for that. So I'm actually going to load that in. Next, I'm going to try the gouache that we spoke of earlier. I'm using the Art Spectrum and just some white gouache. Now that's quite runny. It's probably too runny for my likings. That's a little less runny. So I'll give this one a go. Oh, test sheet. So you can see straight away that the gouache is already covering better than both watercolour whites. So it would go to the top of my list straight away for any highlights that I want added. I would be using gouache. Now with these, I'm going to get one really vibrant dot on top, and then a narrower, softer one going around the edge, and a couple of secondary ones over here. Same, one really vibrant dot on top, secondary one on the edge, and a few little subtle backup ones over here. Let's just wait for that to dry. Okay, now you can see that that has dried. You might also see that there's lighter little fresh bits of green, the glass green around the edges, which I haven't dealt with. Now here are my two main pencils that I use that are watercolour pencils, Faber-Castell, the Albrecht Dürer series. So this is called Weiss White, and my sturdy little Derwent Watercolors Chinese White. Now, this is what I would be using just to start to add a little bit of delicate lightness over the top. So perhaps a little bit more over here. It can go over the top. Yeah. I don't use these very often, purely because I'm the person that will leave white out rather than paint it over the top. But also because you may have seen in techniques I've taught before in my videos, it's very good if you've got good paper and good paint, you can actually wet your brush and you can lift colour out off the page by wetting a patch. Now that's quite a bit that's lifted there. It just means that you're using a clean, smaller brush, so you've got more power pushing through the bristle. Dampen it, but not to the point where it's going to be running. Actually, I'd even dry that off a tiny bit. And then pick the area you want to lighten and repeatedly rub. Try not to lift the brush. Just repeatedly rub forward and backward on that area. Then press heavily, and you can see you're lifting sections out. This is what I'm looking for, and to me this is a nicer effect than the white. The white going over certain colours can go milky, which is not what you ideally want to have happen. This one is even lighter, so it won't be as great a remarkable a result, but we'll still do it. You can still see there that it's lifted. Now on this back one, what I'll do is I'll mark down some masking fluid. I don't use this one very often, but it does come in handy because what it has is a non-clogging wire in the cap. So as you lift that off, pull that out, and this little tiny wire here stops this cap from filling up. So I'll just give it a bit of a squeeze. Again, I don't use this very often, so I'm hoping it hasn't dried up on me. It's good for if you're doing really intricate work. Masking fluid pen. I've had this one for a long time, but it has dried up. This was good. It was from Schminky, and it's masking fluid yet again, but just in a smaller nozzle. This one is, oh no, it's sort of, there you go. It goes like runny cheese, but let's just say we want to use some of this, and I want to put it down the same area. If I wanted to mask this out, I would use just tape to leave my highlights. I'll let that dry, see what happens. It's going to dry quite quickly considering it's already thickened. So you can see there, it's already drying and rubbery. While that's drying, we'll talk about pens. The pens that I like to use the most, and here's an example. There's two different types of pens. I get these from a shop we have here called Officeworks in Australia. I find they're really, really good. They have lots of white pen options now in most big stationery shops. And the Posca pens, which you may be familiar with. Posca. Medium tip or fine tip. You press down to release the paint and give it a bit of a shake. It does give you a really, really, really nice, strong white edge, especially like the darker the colour. You can see it's better than the pens. And obviously if you're doing a watercolour, there's nothing wrong with using a white pastel pencil over the top if you need to add a highlight or a little bit of a lightness to an area. So let us look now at what we have here, and seeing that the masking fluid is now dry, I'm going to come back in with a little bit of my wash of phthalo green, And you literally wash as if it's not there. You just go straight over it without any thought at all of worrying about missing it, being delicate around it. Because this one in front has dried, my paint shouldn't run into it. I'm just going to let that wash dry. As it's drying, I'm going to drop in a little bit of colour. Really subtly. So I've just got the slightest wet brush with some paint in it. That will do me. And let that dry. Okay, so let's have a little test now to see if that's dry. Yes, it's dry. So what I normally do, make sure your hand's clean, but I'll just give it a little rub in a circular motion. There it is on my finger, and it's come off, and as you can see, it's cleanly come off. So I rub just in a clockwise. There it is on my finger. And if it's a long round one, I'll rub the direction, and there you have it. It's a nice, nice contrast as well. I often use I paint in acrylics as well. If you can't find gouache, it's good to get a titanium white in any brand of acrylic, as long as it's a good brand. So yes, titanium white is the one though. That means it's totally opaque and will have very, very good coverage. So you can add it solidly, or you can actually fade it off, or you can water it down as well. It's a water-based paint, but it will dry permanently, not like watercolor or gouache. And there you have it. And of course, the last lesson of today is contrast. Highlights are only as good as shadows. Well, that's it for today. Thank you for joining me, and I hope you learnt something. Have a wonderful week, and I look forward to seeing you next time.